Hi, it's Beth from Aunt Bee's Attic, and today I'm using some more elements from IOD's Winter's Calling transfer. Instead of using the transfer exactly as it comes, I'm cutting apart and layering elements from several different sections to create my own composition. My goal here was to create another piece to look like an old Christmas picture that had been tucked away for years, worn, aged, and full of vintage charm. I started by mixing Sweet Pickins Milk Paint in Juniper. I mixed it to a smooth consistency and spread it evenly across the base to give that first layer of color. Going over raw wood, sometimes it'll drag because it's soaking in so much. So if you just spray a little bit, mist it with water, it can loosen it up and just make the paint thinner so it flows better. After that dried, I mixed up some Proper, also from Sweet Pickins. Instead of brushing it evenly across the surface, I just added some all over strokes, misted that with water, and then dabbed at the paint. It gave it just a completely different texture. I continued working my way across the piece, adding and removing color as I went. Some spots I thought had gotten a little too much of the Proper, so I used a fan brush to bring back a little more of the juniper back to the top. If you use just a fan brush, it puts it on thinner so that the color below can still shine through a little bit. Then I decided maybe to mix the two colors together to get me a third color that still went with both of them well. I went back and forth, made some a little more blue, some a little more brown. And dabbed that back too. I was just trying to create different shades and variations throughout the background so it would have plenty of depth once everything else was added. It was definitely a play-as-you-go background. I just kept dabbing, layering, and adding color until I felt there was enough variation. Before adding the transfer, I applied a top coat over the milk paint. I wanted to make sure I had a nice sealed surface so I wouldn't risk lifting any of the milk paint when I applied the transfer, and so that the transfer would also adhere well. I do like the transfer the way it comes. It's absolutely beautiful, but I needed more length from the birds and pine piece, and I didn't want it to be just for the month of December, so I figured I could change out the words to Winter's Calling and it would last all season long. So I started cutting apart the different elements I wanted to use. I pulled pieces from several different pages and began building my own design. It's one of my favorite things about using transfers. You can certainly use them exactly as they're designed and they're beautiful, but you can also cut them apart, layer different elements together, and completely change the composition. And some of it, I had no idea what I was putting on next until I found the gap that I needed to fill. I love this little hanging bell, so I knew I wanted to work that into the piece for sure. That just looked a little too fresh, so I decided to pull out a little bit of sandpaper and I sanded ever so lightly just to distress it a tiny bit. This bird, you can see I actually cut the tail just so I could bend those feathers down so you could still see both birds. I just didn't like the two bows together, and so that's why I cut the full ribbon off. Because there's already stamps and whatnot in the background, I pulled a couple more of those. And in that part where I really couldn't put anything over that Winter's Calling card, I just pulled out some of the proper and painted in that little space. And as it dried, you see it sort of just blended right in. And looks like the letters just wore off. And that little bow definitely needed to add that, so I put it at the bottom of the pine branch, and I thought it looked perfect. Madagascar Mocha gave me the ability to touch up those parts where when I separated the pine, the branches were gone. And I used the IOD ephemeral type stamp and added bits of lettering and script in the background, just so it went more to the edges and looked a little more filled in everywhere. I love the way those faded stamp details make it look like there are even more layers going on. It gives the piece that old paper and ephemeral look without taking attention away from the main design. So now I stepped away from the center picture and I started to work on the frame. I painted it completely with a mix of DIY's paint in chocolate and weathered wood. Together, those two colors created a really nice old grayish brown tone. With this bird, I felt it was blending in too much with the background, and I noticed it while I was working, so I went back and added some proper over it so it got less blue in it. Then I wanted to add a little to this frame. I thought it needed to be a little more ornate for this picture. So I pulled out some of my IOD Trimmings Mould and made a few different pieces that I thought might be what I wanted. I ended up choosing this design from the original Trimmings 1 mold. This is an older version of the mold where the ends of the trim pieces still had the straight edge. Now they make it curved to fit them together to continue your pattern easier. But if you have the old version, you can see it's possible to extend the length if you're using clay. When I had my longer pieces, you just lay them out over top of each other, and to get that nice diagonal at the corner, you just cut through both of them at the same time. With mine's just like a putty knife that I used. I didn't want the moldings to look like they're just added on top, so I used that same paint to match them to the frame for their first coat. Then just later I'll add embellishments on top of other colors. That way it unifies it all together. Here I'm adding a little bit of Dark It Decrepit just to tone down those whites and actually the whole thing a bit, just to give it a little bit of an aged appearance. It wasn't quite doing enough for me, so I decided I needed to crackle. First, put on step 1, you let that dry, and it has to get to a tacky stage. At that point, then you can add step 2, and as it dries, you can see the crackle starting to show. I decided to try Sweet Pickins dark oil wax to get down on that crackle. I didn't want my crackle to be too dark to cover up any of the elements. It did show, but I just wasn't sure yet. So when I saw the crackle wasn't showing up enough, I went over it with some more of the oil wax, and then I even added some of the Sweet Pickins dark beeswax just to get those crackles to show a little more. I went back to the frame to work on that. This is a day later, and you can see I had ended up with gaps in my clay. When that happens, I just filled with other clay, and then I used like a pin or a blade to sort of engrave a little bit of the design into it so it doesn't look like just a straight piece stuck in there. I painted again with the original color. And I worked pretty hard to get the white spots to disappear because there's a lot of depth in there, and if you just keep turning your piece around looking, you can get most of them to disappear. Once that was dry, I added Venetian bronze onto the trimmings part, and I believe I did just some little touches down on the edge of the frame. That's actually adding a top coat to the part that didn't have the Venetian bronze over it, because that paint stays active if you don't seal it, because it's Debbie's clay paint. And then I decided I needed to bring out that bell in the picture a little bit, and adding some gold to the frame was going to highlight the frame and bring those two elements together. By not painting it solid, it still looks like it's an older piece with some of the gold embellishments wearing back. And here it is. I'm so happy with the way this piece turned out. I love how all the different layers come together and how rearranging the Winter's Calling transfer created something completely different from the original design. Between this milk paint, the stamp details, the crackle, the dark wax, and that aged frame, it really does look to me like an old Christmas picture you might have found tucked away and forgotten. And with all those beautiful birds, botanicals, and little vintage elements, it becomes its own complete unique piece. I'd love to know what you think of this one, so let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this project, make sure to give the video a like and subscribe to follow along for more projects if you aren't already. Hope you're enjoying the series on the IOD Christmas release, and there'll be many more to come. Thanks so much for watching.